I'm Elena Clark, 28 years old, and I'm sitting in this courtroom watching my billionaire husband laugh as he signs our divorce papers. Walter always thought I was just an ambitious consultant with pretty eyes and limited means. Little did he know that while he was flaunting his affair with a venture capitalist, I was quietly running a $50 billion empire he never knew existed. The judge is about to read my financial disclosure statement, and I can't wait to see that arrogant smirk vanish from his face. Before I tell you how my soon-to-be ex-husband's entire world collapsed in under 30 seconds, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they had all the power. I was a sharp corporate consultant from Chicago who'd built a quiet reputation in the mergers and acquisitions world. I had a talent for financial restructuring and crisis management, skills that kept me traveling between boardrooms from New York to Singapore. My true background, however, was something I'd carefully hidden my entire adult life. I met Walter at a charity gala in Manhattan. I was there representing one of my consulting clients when he approached my table. He was a self-made tech billionaire from a working-class Boston background, and he radiated the kind of aggressive confidence that only comes from clawing your way to the top and never looking back. You have excellent taste in champagne. Most people at these events don't know the difference, were his first words to me, gesturing at my glass with that trademark smirk. At the time, I thought it was charming banter. Now I realize it was both a test and a warning of how he'd treat me throughout our entire marriage. He seemed like an exciting match, driven, brilliant, successful, and apparently fascinated by me despite my understated presence. Our romance moved quickly. Walter flew me to Monaco for weekends, introduced me to tech titans and hedge fund managers, and offered me a glimpse into a world of wealth I pretended to find intoxicating. But from the very beginning, he was constantly reshaping me to fit his vision. He criticized my sensible work wardrobe, insisted I cut ties with my mediocre consulting firm, and made pointed comments about my college friends being small thinkers with no vision. I was earning a solid six-figure income as a senior consultant, work I genuinely loved for its intellectual challenges and strategic complexity. Walter, however, dismissed it as cute career cosplay, frequently suggesting I didn't need to exhaust myself for what he called pocket change. Why waste your potential on corporate busywork when you could be building something real with me? He'd say, never understanding that my career was a carefully constructed cover, not my actual life's work. After 8 months of whirlwind dating, he proposed during a private dinner at Per Se in Manhattan. The ring was flawless, the setting orchestrated for maximum spectacle, and the proposal perfectly calculated to make me feel chosen. The entire restaurant erupted in applause. It felt like the ultimate validation, and I accepted without hesitation. Our wedding was an extravagant affair at his estate in the Hamptons, despite my preference for something more intimate. Looking back, I realized that was the first major battle I lost against Walter's need to control the narrative. We need to make a statement. You're marrying into a certain level of expectations now, he'd said, dismissing my concerns with a patronizing kiss on the forehead. That was my first real glimpse of how Walter truly saw me. Not as an equal partner, but as a beautiful acquisition he'd won, someone who needed his guidance to navigate his elite world. After our honeymoon in the Maldives, we moved into his penthouse in Tribeca, one of Manhattan's most exclusive addresses. Walter liked to say we met by accident, as if fate had bumped us together between courses at that Manhattan gala. In reality, nothing about that night was accidental. I was there on a carefully scheduled consulting mandate, hired to evaluate a distressed portfolio company. He was there to hunt. His eyes moved over the room like a man scouting potential acquisitions, pausing when he found something undervalued. When he finally approached me, it was with the same assessing look he gave balance sheets and term sheets. I recognized it instantly and let him believe I did not. He thought he was choosing a beautiful, moderately successful consultant who would be grateful for his attention. I let him think that because it suited a different agenda. Marrying Walter Baker gave me a shield, a loud, glittering distraction that kept curious eyes away from the Clark Group and the true scope of my responsibilities. As long as the world believed I had traded up into his fortune, no one would look closely enough to notice that my supposed side projects could quietly move markets. The courtship unfolded like a textbook transaction. He performed generosity. I performed awe. He upgraded my flights to private jets, my hotel rooms to penthouse suites, my dinners to chef's tables with impossible wait lists. I let him, cataloging every move, studying how he negotiated, how he treated people he considered beneath him, how quickly his charm curdled when someone told him no. To Walter, I was a rare asset he had discovered early, before the rest of the market caught on. To me, he was a very public firewall. The shift came almost immediately after the wedding. The morning after our return from the Maldives, his tone changed by a few degrees, subtle enough that most people would have missed it. He suggested I take a temporary break from consulting to settle into our life. The words coded in affection, the subtext written in cold ink. Then came the calendar blocks he added without asking, labeling my working hours as personal time. The introductions he arranged always emphasized my looks, never my expertise. When a long-term client called with an urgent project, Walter listened to the voicemail, deleted it, and told me they would find someone else who needs the scraps. My minimal, public-facing work vanished under the guise of protection and luxury, and he congratulated himself on rescuing me from what he called corporate drudgery, never suspecting that the only thing he had really given me was proof of how little he understood the woman he married. The prenuptial agreement arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday night, buried between board packets and market reports. Walter's message was breezy, almost playful, as if he were sending me a meme instead of a legal blueprint for our future. Standard stuff. He wrote, "My team just needs this wrapped before the wedding planner locks in the venue." The attached document, however, was anything but casual. It was a fortress, drafted by a law firm that specialized in keeping men like Walter insulated from regret. He suggested we review it together over champagne in his penthouse. By review, he meant he would skim the first page aloud, summarize the rest in his own words, and assume my signature would follow. The tone was light, the view over the city spectacular, his hand resting possessively on my knee, as he explained how it was just a formality, to calm his board and placate his advisors. "You know this isn't about you," he said. "It's about optics. Billionaires don't get married without paperwork, otherwise the vultures start circling." What he did not know was that my own legal team had seen a version of this long before I pretended to open it for the first time, hidden behind innocuous language about separate estates and pre-existing holdings. There was a clause Walter's attorneys believed they had inserted for his protection. It stated, in precise terms, that any premarital assets kept in independently managed structures would remain entirely outside marital reach, immune from claims, redistribution, or disclosure beyond a confidential schedule delivered only to the court if necessary. They wanted to ensure that no one could touch the portfolio Walter had amassed before me. That clause had not originated with them. My lawyers had quietly suggested the wording months earlier, during the first round of back-channel conversations, when Walter's people assumed they were negotiating with a moderately successful consultant eager to prove she wasn't after his money. They framed it as an industry standard, a way to calm high-net-worth clients and streamline proceedings if the marriage ever failed. Walter's team loved it. They expanded its scope, added sharper language, tightened every screw, proud of themselves for building an impenetrable wall around his billions. Sitting on that sofa, I let him walk me through his interpretation of the document, nodding at the right moments, asking small, harmless questions to reassure him I trusted his judgment. When he finally slid the pen across the coffee table, his eyes held that familiar mixture of confidence and condescension. The look of a man certain he had secured the upper hand forever. I signed in a smooth, practiced motion, my name looping neatly across the line beneath his. He kissed my hand, believing he had just protected everything that mattered. In reality, he had locked my $50 billion beyond his reach with his own favorite weapon, paperwork he never bothered to truly understand. Walter's betrayal didn't arrive as a confession or an apology. It arrived as a photograph, embedded in a news alert on my phone while I was in a conference room pretending to care about a minor acquisition. Walter on a yacht off Capri, his hand on the waist of a rising political strategist whose family name opened doors even his money could not. The caption was efficient: tech billionaire Walter Baker rumored to be moving on. The article quoted sources close to him, suggesting our marriage had been a mismatch of ambition and background. Language so polished I recognized his PR team's fingerprints. By the time he finally spoke to me, the decision had already been executed. He called from a blocked number, his voice unbothered, almost cheerful, as he announced he was filing for divorce. He framed it as a strategic pivot, the way he would discuss exiting an underperforming asset. "We rushed into this," he said. "You'll be fine. My attorneys will make sure you're taken care of." The next morning, a courier delivered the paperwork to my door, along with a proposed settlement that would not have covered a single quarter's operating costs for my smallest subsidiary. A token apartment, a modest cash payment spread over several years, the quiet expectation that I would sign, disappear, and be grateful. The smear campaign began before the ink on his petition dried. Articles appeared painting me as an opportunistic consultant who had overestimated her role in his life. Anonymous insiders hinted that I had been unstable, overly emotional, obsessed with status. Old photographs from my early 20s surfaced online. Framed as evidence of my alleged desperation to climb, commentators speculated that I would struggle financially after losing access to his resources, that my short-lived fairy tale had ended in predictable disappointment. He wanted the public to see me as a gold digger who had miscalculated, a woman who had gambled on a billionaire and lost. What amused me most was the certainty with which he spoke through those planted quotes. Walter believed he was writing the final version of our story, closing the book with a flourish that left him triumphant and me diminished. He thought the legal fortress he'd built around his fortune made him untouchable, that the prenuptial agreement he'd pushed across that coffee table ensured I would crawl away with whatever crumbs he chose to offer. Reading his narrative in the press, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not heartbreak, but a calm, clinical curiosity about how he would react when he discovered that the one asset he had never bothered to evaluate properly was the woman he had just tried to discard. The morning after the first headlines broke, I forwarded Walter's settlement offer to an encrypted address that didn't appear in any of my known contact lists. An hour later, my real attorney called on a secure line that never rang by accident. He didn't waste time with sympathy. "So," he said, his voice dry, "Mr. Baker has decided he's finished with the arrangement. How theatrical is he planning to make this?" I sent him the yacht photographs, the leaked quotes, the laughable proposal that assumed I had nowhere else to go. Silence, then a short, amused exhale. "All right, Elena." Then we stop observing and start playing. Within days, the Clark Group's inner circle was fully activated. My chief financial officer, a woman who could dismantle a multinational balance sheet in a single afternoon, assembled updated valuations and verification letters that never touched public servers. The family's private counsel mapped out every jurisdictional angle, every disclosure rule, every pressure point in the prenuptial language Walter's team believed they owned. We spoke in short, precise calls, always under the assumption that someone, somewhere, might be listening. No one used Walter's name. He was simply the counterparty. The strategy we built was simple and ruthless. On the surface, my local divorce attorney carefully selected to appear overwhelmed by Walter's reputation, engaged with his lawyers as expected. She responded slowly, apologized for delays, and hinted that her client was frightened and just wanted this over with. She let them believe the token offer had landed exactly where Walter intended, squarely on a woman with limited options. Meanwhile, my real team prepared the nuclear file, a complete, audited breakdown of the Clark Group's structure, my controlling position, and the valuation that would make his net worth look like an accounting rounding error. Every move in the official negotiation was designed to feed his arrogance. When his attorney suggested shaving a little off the already insulting payment, my representative countered with an even smaller request, attaching a careful note about respecting his need to protect his assets. They congratulated themselves on their efficiency, reporting back to him that I was folding exactly on schedule. In private, we tracked filing deadlines and court calendars, choosing the precise moment when the full disclosure would have to land on the judge's desk, leaving Walter's team no time to reframe the narrative. Watching the pieces slide into place, I felt that familiar detachment return, the one I used in hostile takeovers and crisis restructurings. Walter thought he was orchestrating my exit. In reality, he was a man on a brightly lit stage, reciting lines someone else had written, unaware that the curtain would fall the second the court opened the envelope with my name on it. The first delay came disguised as an apology. Walter's attorney sent a polished email explaining that an unexpected scheduling conflict required rescheduling our preliminary hearing in the interest of ensuring full and fair representation for all parties. The new date was pushed a month out. A week later, another conflict appeared, this time a medical emergency, then a complex international transaction that apparently required Walter's personal oversight. Every excuse was courteous, professionally phrased, and transparently tactical. They were stalling, confident I would grow tired, embarrassed, or broke. On paper, the delays looked like routine congestion in an overworked court system. In private, Walter treated them like entertainment. He began calling late at night from numbers that cycled constantly, his voice smooth with manufactured concern. "You don't have to drag this out," he would say. "You're only making this harder on yourself." When I didn't respond the way he wanted, the tone shifted. He reminded me how expensive litigation could be, how unforgiving the press was when a woman overplayed her hand against a man of his stature. He described my future in soft, patronizing detail. The cramped apartment, the faded wardrobe, the quiet slide back into obscurity. Once his last name was stripped from mine, each time a new continuance notice landed, my supposed local attorney responded with resigned acceptance, reinforcing the image of a client running low on resources and resolve. Walter's team leaned into it. They flooded us with document requests that were irrelevant, repetitive, and intrusive. Confident the administrative burden would crush me, they demanded records from my brief consulting years, bank statements from accounts that barely registered as background noise compared to the structures that actually mattered. When my responses arrived meticulously complete and on time, they read this not as discipline, but as desperation. Walter seemed to enjoy narrating his version of events directly to me. "You should have taken the first offer," he said during one call, the sound of ice clinking in a glass on his end. "You'll look smarter walking away with something instead of nothing." He laughed then. A low, indulgent sound that belonged in a boardroom where a junior executive had made a naive pitch. In his mind, I was that junior executive, clinging to a failing position while the adults in the room patiently waited for reality to sink in. What he never considered was that patience was my natural state. I had spent years operating in timelines measured not in months, but in generations. Delay to Walter was a weapon. To me, it was simply another variable to manage. Every continuance, every mocking voicemail, every smug message reinforced the story he was telling himself about who held the power. And with each passing week, the gap between his perception and the truth grew wide enough to swallow him whole. The Clark Group was never meant to be a secret, not in the beginning. It was built in 1947 by my great-grandfather, a shipping magnate who quietly diversified into infrastructure, energy, and emerging technologies long before those sectors had the vocabulary they carry now. By the time I was born, the family portfolio had evolved into something that didn't announce itself in public filings or press releases. We owned pieces of industries that powered cities, connected continents, and shaped policy from positions so deeply embedded in the global economy that visibility would have been a liability. My grandfather taught me the first rule when I was 12 years old, standing in his study, while he showed me a map covered in pins marking assets most people didn't know were connected. "The moment people know what you control," he said, "is the moment they start trying to control you." He died when I was 19, and the chairmanship passed to my father, who reinforced the principle with military precision. No magazine profiles, no charity galas with our name embossed on ballroom walls, no leaked Forbes estimates or public speculation about net worth. We existed in the infrastructure, not the headlines. When my father's health failed unexpectedly during my mid-20s, the board voted unanimously to transfer operational control to me, not because I was the eldest or the only heir, but because I had spent a decade learning every corner of the empire. From rare earth mining operations in Australia to data centers buried beneath Scandinavian mountains, the public story became that I was a corporate consultant with a respectable but unremarkable career. A narrative I built with deliberate care. I took visible contracts, attended industry conferences, maintained a LinkedIn profile that suggested competence without brilliance. It was a decoy, designed to satisfy the casual curiosity of anyone who might wonder what the youngest Clark was doing with her life. The truth was that I controlled assets valued conservatively at $50 billion, a figure that shifted depending on commodity cycles, currency fluctuations, and geopolitical developments most people only encountered as background noise on the evening news. Walter's net worth, impressive by any conventional measure, was roughly 4% of mine. He had built an empire. I had inherited one and quietly expanded it into something that made his accomplishments look like a successful regional franchise. When I married him, I was not acquiring status or security. I was buying camouflage. As long as the world believed I had traded up into his fortune, no analyst, no journalist, no rival conglomerate would look closely enough to notice that the woman pouring champagne at his fundraisers also chaired quarterly strategy meetings that moved billions across borders while he slept. On the morning of the final hearing, the city looked washed clean, the streets slick from a night of rain that hadn't quite decided whether to leave. I arrived at the courthouse early, not because I needed the time, but because Walter believed punctuality was a symptom of anxiety. I wanted him to see me sitting there, composed, as if this were simply another item on a crowded agenda. He swept in with his entourage 15 minutes late, all polished shoes and dark suits, his laughter echoing down the corridor like he already knew the ending. What he didn't see was the path the real story had taken to get here. 2 hours earlier, in a quiet office 3 floors below the main courtroom, a clerk signed for a nondescript, flat package, delivered by hand. No courier logo, no dramatic markings, just a neatly printed label addressed to the judge, with my name written in the corner in discreet, familiar script. Inside, beneath layers of plain cardboard and security seals, rested the audited financial statement my team had been refining for months. Every holding, every trust, every controlling interest, professionally valued and cross-referenced, accompanied by letters from firms whose reputations made argument pointless. Timing was everything. If we'd submitted it weeks earlier, Walter's attorneys would have dissected it, searched for angles, prepared motions, and preemptively spun the story to the press. If we'd held it back any longer, the judge could have ruled without ever seeing the full picture. So we aimed for the narrowest possible window, late enough that it landed in chambers just before the hearing, early enough that the court was obligated to review it before finalizing anything. While Walter joked with his lawyer outside the courtroom, the judge sat in chambers, leafing through page after page of figures that rearranged the hierarchy of everyone involved. The cover letter was brief, respectfully citing the very clause his own team had insisted upon in the prenuptial agreement, the one safeguarding premarital assets held in independent structures. Attached was the confidential schedule that clause referenced, a document that transformed me from the supposedly dependent spouse in Walter's petition into a financial entity the court could not afford to misunderstand. By the time the bailiff opened the doors and called our case, the package had done its work. The judge's expression carried a new weight, a quiet, measured intensity that hadn't been there at the previous hearings. Walter interpreted it as deference. His lawyer took it as a sign that their delays and pressure had paid off. I recognized something else entirely. The look of someone who had just realized the foundation of the story they'd been told was, at best, incomplete. I smoothed my skirt, rose when my name was called, and walked to my seat, feeling the calm that came when a carefully laid strategy finally left your hands and entered the record. Walter still thought we were here to close out a simple, predictable transaction. He didn't know that the most important document in the room had already arrived without his knowledge, signed, sealed, and waiting like a quiet detonation in the judge's file. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, who had built her career on refusing to be impressed by wealth or intimidated by power. Her reputation preceded her, fair, meticulous, and utterly intolerant of theatrics. When she entered the courtroom, the room fell into the kind of silence that didn't need a gavel. Walter straightened slightly, adjusting his cuffs, his expression carrying that familiar certainty that people like him always landed on the winning side of these proceedings. She opened the file on her desk with deliberate care, the kind of movements that suggested ritual more than urgency. The standard documents came first, petitions and responses she had reviewed before. Then her fingers paused on something new, something that clearly had not been part of the previous hearings. The shift in her posture was subtle but unmistakable. Her back straightened, her reading slowed. Her eyes moved across the page once, then again. As if confirming what couldn't possibly be accurate, the silence deepened. Walter's lawyer leaned forward slightly, trying to read her expression. Finding nothing, I watched the judge's face transition through stages: confusion, then focus, then something close to disbelief. She turned the page, then another. The audited valuation summary was precise, clinical, impossible to misinterpret. When she reached the final line, the one that aggregated everything into a single, staggering figure, she paused for a full 3 seconds before looking up. $50 billion. The number sat in the air between us like a verdict no one had prepared for. Walter, still lounging in his chair with that casual arrogance, hadn't yet noticed the change. He was whispering something to his attorney, probably another joke about how quickly this would wrap. Then the judge spoke, her voice measured and professional, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room lock into attention. "Mr. Baker, I need to clarify something regarding the financial disclosures in this matter." Walter's smirk didn't falter immediately. He turned toward her, eyebrows raised in polite curiosity, ready to accept whatever formality was required to finalize his victory. "Of course, Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement you've cited extensively protects premarital assets held in separate structures. Your petition assumes you are the primary holder of such assets in this marriage." "That's correct," Walter said, his tone still light, still confident. The judge looked directly at him. And for the first time, I saw the faintest crack in her professional neutrality. Not sympathy. Something closer to clinical fascination at what was about to unfold. "Mr. Baker, according to the confidential financial statement filed this morning, your wife's premarital holdings are valued at approximately $50 billion. The courtroom didn't gasp. It simply stopped. Walter's face froze mid-expression, the smirk collapsing into something unreadable. The color drained from his skin in real time, starting at his jawline and spreading upward until he looked like a man who had just been told the floor beneath him no longer existed. His mouth opened slightly, no sound emerging, his eyes darting to his attorney as if demanding an explanation, a correction, anything that would reset reality to the version he recognized. His lawyer looked equally paralyzed, flipping frantically through the file in front of him, searching for the disclosure that had somehow bypassed every defense they'd built. The judge let the silence stretch, giving everyone time to absorb the number that had just detonated in the middle of the narrative Walter had so carefully constructed. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the calm inevitability of someone simply applying the law to facts that could no longer be argued. "This court has reviewed the prenuptial agreement, executed by both parties, and finds it valid and enforceable," she said. "The language regarding premarital assets held in separate, independently managed structures is clear. Those assets remain the sole property of the individual who brought them into the marriage." Walter's attorney tried to recover, stumbling through an objection that wasn't really an objection, suggesting the agreement hadn't been drafted with this scale of disparity in mind. The judge cut him off with a single raised hand. "Counselor, your firm drafted the agreement. Your client signed it. The court will not entertain the idea that the document is suddenly ambiguous now that it protects the other spouse." Her gaze flicked briefly toward me. Not with warmth, but with a kind of professional acknowledgement, the way a chess arbiter might nod at a checkmate executed cleanly within the rules. She turned back to the bench papers. "Accordingly, Mrs. Clark's premarital estate, as detailed in the confidential financial statement on file, is confirmed as separate property. It is not subject to division, claim, or encumbrance by Mr. Baker." Each word landed with the finality of a closing door. "Mr. Baker retains his own premarital and marital assets, as outlined in the disclosures previously submitted. The only matter granted today is the dissolution of the marriage. For a man who loved to win, you get nothing," was a remarkably quiet defeat. Walter didn't shout or pound the table. He just sat there, shoulders slightly caved in, staring at the polished surface of the counsel table, as if it might offer a version of events in which this was still salvageable. His lawyer leaned in, whispering rapidly, but there was nothing left to negotiate. The very fortress they had built to shield his wealth now stood impenetrably around mine. The judge asked me one final question. procedural and simple. Did I understand and accept the terms as read into the record? I answered yes, my voice steady, my hands relaxed in my lap. There was no triumph in it, only a clean, exact sense of alignment, as if the world had finally caught up to a truth I'd been carrying alone for too long. When the hearing adjourned, the room exploded into motion, papers shuffled, chairs scraped, muted exclamations rose from the back rows where reporters pretended not to be listening. Walter remained seated for a moment longer, then stood abruptly, avoiding my eyes as if looking at me might make the number more real. I watched him gather himself. The man who had laughed signing the divorce papers suddenly reduced to managing the optics of having discarded one of the wealthiest women on the planet for what amounted to spare change. I walked out without hurry, my heels clicking softly against the stone floor of the corridor. No one stopped me. No one asked for a comment. Outside, the air felt cooler, sharper, as if the city itself had shifted by a fraction of a degree. My phone buzzed in my bag with messages I didn't need to read to understand. Confirmations from my team, notifications of filings completed, markets already adjusting in places where my name would never appear. For the first time since saying yes in that over-orchestrated restaurant, I felt completely unentangled. Walter had his freedom. The hollow victory he'd pursued so eagerly, I had mine, infinitely quieter and far more absolute. I reached the steps, paused for a moment at the top, and then descended into a life where my power no longer needed camouflage, and where his opinion of my worth no longer mattered at all. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought, and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.